Good morning. Welcome to the webinar on the Biosimilar Red Tape Elimination Act. I'm going to just kind of go through an introduction and then we're going to begin the presentation, but I want to thank everybody for joining us here today. This is the third ASBM webinar on interchangeable biosimilars. The first two were informational. This one is extremely focused, and we, by the end of the next hour, intend to provide a fair and objective assessment of Senate Bill 2305, the Biosimilar Red Tape Elimination Act. To do this, we will examine physician, pharmacist, regulator, and patient perspectives on the legislation, and I'm extremely pleased to have the panel that I have here today. Just by way of background, I'm the executive director of the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines. It's a position that I have held for the past 14 years. We were formed after the Affordable Care Act established the biosimilar pathway here in the U.S. back in 2010. Prior to that, I spent the majority of my career in government, in and out of government, including 6 years in the Office of the Secretary at the Department of Health and Human Services from 2002 to 2008. Before we begin, though, I would like to allow the panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves, and I would like to start with Andy Spiegel, who I have had the pleasure of working with for all of those 14 years at ASBM. Andy?
Yes. Thank you, Michael. Good to see everybody. My name is Andrew Spiegel, and I wear a number of hats, including the CEO of the Global Colon Cancer Association, which is an umbrella organization of all colorectal cancer patient groups around the world. I'm also the board chair of the World Patients Alliance, which is the largest nonprofit umbrella organization working across all diseases with about 670 members from 135 countries. But the hat that I'm wearing today, as Michael says, is as a co-founder of the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines. When I met Michael now 14 years ago, and we've been working together over those 14 years to ensure that the patient voice is represented and that patients are the center of biosimilar policies as they've been enacted, both in the United States, but even around the globe. We have literally traveled the world ensuring that the patients are at the forefront of all these biosimilar policies that have been put in place over the last almost 15 years around the world. Including dozens of visits to the World Health Organization and countries all around the world, just to make sure that these policies are patient-friendly. So that's the hat I'm wearing today, and looking forward to sharing a few comments about the topic. Over to you.
Hi, my name is Phil Schneider, and I'm a professor of pharmacy at The Ohio State University College of Pharmacy. I also serve as chair of the International Advisory Board for the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines. In my academic career, I'm a pharmacist by training, but I'm in academia and focuses on the medication use process with a particular focus on patient safety. Ralph?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Dr. Ralph McKibben, and I'll be going first. And I'm a practicing physician in Western Pennsylvania. And I wear a number of hats as well. And I think in this stakeholder era, we all try to interact and give each other assistance and learn from each other. As a practicing physician, one of my key motivations, which is an ethical consideration, is to advocate for my patients and the doctor-patient relationship. So to do that, I have been on the state level, the president of the Pennsylvania Society of Gastroenterology. At present, I'm a clinical professor of gastroenterology at the Duquesne College of Medicine. I'm also past president of the Digestive Disease National Coalition, which is a clinical umbrella organization in Washington, D.C. that advocates on the Hill in all levels for policy beneficial to all gastroenterology patients. I'm currently the chair of the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines. And I'm also a governor of the American College of Gastroenterology, so I continue to advocate on all levels. So what I'm going to talk about today is sort of the doctor-patient relationship and why it's important to look at that. Let's see, can I move these slides?
Yeah.
I think so. Okay. So as we talked about biosimilarity, a pathway was created and existed Remember that biosimilar medicines are not generics. They're not identical. They're highly similar to the reference product. And this is, intellectually a bit of a challenge, and decisions had to be made. How do we evaluate these things? How do we make sure they're safe and efficacious? And so as stakeholders got together, and Andy and Michael can tell you about this because they were very much involved on the state level of getting the 50 states to pass laws about how these things can be substituted. So what you do is you demonstrate similarity on a structural and chemical basis, and you do not necessarily have to do a lot of expensive and lengthy clinical trials. That is something that's up to the FDA to decide, but there is a lot of structural comparison. And on a simple basis, I like to talk about these big Lego constructs that people make. Biosimilars are huge antibodies, lots and lots of molecules in there, and they're very, very similar. So to be a biosimilar, just to let you know, there is no one size fits all on the biosimilar side. And similarly, I'll say the same thing about patient care in a bit. So you do the structural and functional studies. There are animal studies for toxicology, the things that have been developed over the years. As a physician, I've been practice for almost 40 years. I will tell you that quality is a moving target. It's a process, not a thing. You can't put a rubber stamp on it and say one size fits all forever. We know that to be true with automobiles and product recalls, et cetera. So we want ongoing evaluation. Clinical pharmacology studies that have evolved over the years to include now controlled studies and blinded controlled studies are done to show this. The additional clinical studies can be done to evaluate the biosimilar has no structural difference. And that's where we get into the interchangeables. I will show on a slide here, but an interchangeable biosimilar is a pharmacy definition. Biosimilars are very, very similar. Physicians have opinions on when and how to use them. Most of that derives from the doctor-patient relationship and the complications that go into that. But we want to see that there is no difference in these biosimilars. Switching studies are not mandated. The FDA has the ability to do that, and they have the flexibility. And as shown on this slide, interchangeable biosimilars have not all required switching studies. So just to note, some people say that physicians don't support the idea of biosimilars and that we're afraid of them, but there are positive comments as shown here by these clinical groups that's saying, look, this is a good thing. They applaud the FDA draft guidance. When you're doing clinical work and people from different stakeholder groups get together, sometimes words have different definitions. So a lot of people in the biosimilar realm are saying, well, the US should be like Europe because everything's interchangeable. There's a difference in the definition. In Europe, interchangeable means the physician can prescribe any of the approved medications. In the US, I can do that on all biosimilars. I can prescribe any of them. Coverage is a separate question, but I can prescribe them. Interchangeable biosimilar in the United States is a pharmacy level substitution, similar to what is done in generics. So I send my patient who may have subtle differences and reasons not to switch, but they are substituted at the pharmacy with or without notification. That's always the concern, is that we don't get there in time to block the switch. So in Europe, automatic pharmacy substitution is rare and in fact is usually banned. The ASBM, as part of its mission over the last 14 years, does physician prescriber surveys. And if you look at our website, and there's actually a QR code there for looking at this, we have done studies over the years. The most recent, not the most recent, but a recent US study of physicians, all of whom are prescribers of biosimilars, show that there's a high level of confidence in them. 92% felt confident in using biosimilars. Particularly when you're coming up with a new patient. So if someone comes in, they're naive, they've never been on medication, I'll prescribe whichever is beneficial to the patient in terms of cost, coverage, et cetera. And that's where this comes from. in terms of switching, it's generally felt by physicians, 80%, they want some degree of control when switching a patient to a biosimilar. So, for instance, clinical studies tend to be grounded in the middle of the road patient, if you will, on the bell curve of disease. Patients come in, they can be 100 years old or 3 years old. They could have 8 to 10% of all patients with Crohn's, for instance, have other immune diseases. So you may be treating coexisting conditions. People have kidney failure, liver failure, et cetera. So switching may or may not be comfortable for the physician and the patient. And often it takes a long time to get there. So anyway, 20% are not comfortable with doing this. They want some level of control. And that has to do with that doctor-patient relationship and control of the physician by the physician and the patient. So the physician with the patient decides which treatment option to use is by far and away the most likely scenario that we agree with. Again, I started talking about one size does not fit all, and I can use the example just real quick, simple single molecule things. There's a difference between a liquid and a tablet and a pill and a capsule. If you've had a stroke and have difficulty swallowing, just because the active ingredient's the same doesn't mean you can get it down easily. Okay, that's one example. And then there's gluten patients. The generics may have gluten in the binders of the pill, and so there's difficulties. There's a process here. The active ingredient's the same, but the excipients, dissolving agents, et cetera, may be different. And so there's a process of getting to this treatment decision. So this goes then back to the majority of physicians are not comfortable with third-party switching. We feel the patient has a formulary, we prescribe it, we give them something. Yes, we understand there's cost decisions, but sometimes some patients deserve specific care, or it may have taken a long time to get to where they are. Giving the interchangeable designation relieves a lot of this concern. I guess I wouldn't call it anxiety, but it's concern, professional concern. So are you more or less likely to prescribe an interchangeable? The answer is yeah, 57% are more likely to go to that one because they have a higher level of comfort. Even on the right side of the slide, at the level of the pharmacy substitution. So as we're coming up to changes coming in, what we wanted to do was another study to look at, are these still current feelings and definitions? There's been a lot more biosimilars put out, and we want to know what the current state is. So we did a survey of 270 physicians, all of whom are prescribers of biosimilars, and they're from different fields, dermatology, endocrinology, GI, as you can see on the left. And they're roughly equal across the practice areas in this study. So we wanted to look at the comfort of switching with biosimilars, and 87% of respondents agreed they were more comfortable switching a patient from an originator to a biosimilar if it has been specifically evaluated for switching. Okay, that's an important consideration because not everything gets switching studies. And which of the following statements: I strongly believe each interchangeable biosimilar should be individually and specifically evaluated for the impact of switching on safety and efficacy. 88% had strong feelings about this. And what jumps out at me, that's the same number as the other slide almost, but if you look at the 11% at the bottom, yeah, they would say maybe they could be all deemed biosimilar interchangeable. But if you look at it, no one felt strongly that they should all be interchangeable. So even those who were willing to go that far didn't feel strongly about it. At least that's my take on this data. So 85% of respondents agreed that only biosimilars that have been individually evaluated specifically for the impact of switching on safety and efficacy should be deemed interchangeable. In other words, a separate decision was made. It's not just they were called biosimilars, now they're interchangeable. They were given a second level of review to make sure that people are comfortable with the data. Stakeholder concerns were evaluated, and that was done. So 88% of respondents agreed that switching studies increased their level of confidence in the safety of moving patients from an originator reference product to the biosimilar. And so this is, again, consistent across the board. As a sideline, if you look at the comfort of biosimilars, and you can't compare all of our surveys together. They're not all the same design or same questions, but you'll actually find that the level of concern about data is going up with time over the last 14 years, although we still have high levels of confidence in the use of biosimilars. So I'll answer questions when we get to the Q&A at the end, but I will say that the doctor-patient relationship and medications, I'll give one concrete example. We did an ophthalmic survey a couple of years ago for the eye doctors, and as a point of information, 85% of products are used off-label. So the ophthalmologist may use injections for eye diseases in the retina with these biologic agents, but the dissolving agents or excipients of some of these biosimilars are actually not approved for use in the eye. So if they were pharmacy substituted, as an example, they would not be approved. So there's some subtleties to this. The size of injectors for injectables, I talked before about pills and capsules and things like that. These are all concerns. I do just want to say that this is an op-ed that I put in our local paper here to raise the voice here with the patients in our community and around the state, and I continue to be active so that we can get out and get the word out and the stakeholders can put their heads together. Thank you very much, and I'll turn this back to Michael.
Thank you, Dr. McKibben. I'm going to just turn it over to Dr. Schneider. He's going to talk about the state biosimilar substitution policy. And just before he starts, the purpose of having Dr. McKibben and Dr. Schneider go first is to lay the context for the concerns that we have with the Lee bill. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Schneider, and I'll follow him.
Thank you, Michael. The purpose of this presentation is to focus on biosimilar policy in the United States, which is in contrast to what we see in the EU. And a lot of the policy was developed surrounding the concept that biologic medicines are really expensive, and to manage the cost of healthcare and the contribution that medicines make to the cost of healthcare, one of the thoughts was that a biosimilar is a biologic generic. And that, as Dr. McKibben has pointed out, is not the case. And so therefore, a new approach to the substitution of biosimilars for biologics in the name of making responsible use of limited healthcare resources was necessary. Prior to the evolution of biologic medicines, generic substitution laws have enabled pharmacists to provide patients savings at the point of care in their pharmacies by dispensing a generic version of the medicine, which is much less expensive, and a substantial cost savings have resulted from that. As Dr. McKibben has pointed out, sometimes certain patients, even with generic medicines, require a specific brand of a medicine, and so a dispense as written provision was included in all the pharmacy practice acts in the United States, which require a pharmacist to dispense the exact product, that the brand of the product that the physician prescribes. But that's not something that is appropriate in the case of biologic medicines. And since pharmacy practice, in fact, medical practice, are all regulated by the states, and we have 50 states in our country, we had to look at 50 different pharmacy practice acts to enable a pharmacist to interchange a less expensive biosimilar without necessarily needing a new prescription. And in order to do that, collaboration and compromise was necessary between physicians and pharmacists in particular, but also insurance companies, patient groups, and manufacturers. And so the final laws that were adopted in all 50 states were a negotiated compromise that were widely supported by state medical associations. So avoiding a conflict between physician prescribers and pharmacists was really an important and achieved aim of the work on these 50 state pharmacy practice acts. And so one of the common arguments for making biosimilars interchangeable is reflecting on policies in Europe, because Europe has been very successful in getting an increase in the adoption of biosimilars. but their system of care does not involve pharmacy level substitution, which is actually forbidden. So physicians do control treatment decisions, and they're free to choose between all the available products, including both originator and biosimilar products. And so in many of these countries, and I think physicians are supportive of this, the effort is to encourage the starting of patients on the lowest cost product, particularly for treatment naive patients. And that often involves a biosimilar. So the physicians are able to manage the cost of biologic therapies, arguably improving access to biologic medicines to more patients by being mindful of the cost. But the decision to switch to a biosimilar is made by the physician. So as I've mentioned, this automatic substitution level in our country, which was an attempt to modify the Pharmacy Practice Acts that deal with generic substitution, was negotiated between pharmacists and physicians, because physicians were initially reluctant to support any automatic substitution of biologics at the pharmacy level for the reasons that Dr. McKibben has shared earlier. And some of the early legislation said, well, pharmacists can do this, but they don't necessarily need a new prescription, but they have to notify the prescriber that a change has been made. And so pharmacy organizations felt that this notification requirement was an onerous one because it would add to their workload. And it's something that they didn't think that they needed to do, that they were empowered to make this choice. So what was negotiated in terms of these Pharmacy Practice Acts that permit the substitution of interchangeable biosimilars is that if the FDA designates a biosimilar as being interchangeable, based on switching studies or not, if they decide that those aren't necessary, that those are the only ones that can be substituted by a pharmacist. Physicians, like they can with generic medicines, are able to prevent a substitution at the pharmacy level if they feel it's inappropriate by writing the words dispense as written, or DAW, on the prescription. And that's the same as exists with generic medicines. The pharmacists agreed that the dialogue between prescribers, patients, and the pharmacist was important when we discussed this. And as health policy legislators felt that this was important as well. So we negotiated a 3 to 5 day time period for the notification or communication is made, and maintaining patient records is part of that. And so that patients also need to know that a substitution is being made, because it's different. They'll receive a medication that's different than what they're prescribed, their physician prescribed. So while all 50 states have agreed on this change in the State Pharmacy Practice Acts that do empower pharmacists to make changes in the interest of managing the cost of therapy, states still recognize the difference between interchangeable and non-interchangeable. And at least one state in our country is recommending that the state legislature add language that permits the substitution of non-interchangeable biosimilars. So considering that, in other words, deleting the provision that the biosimilar has to be interchangeable. So there's still flexibility among the states in our country to make their own decisions about biologics and biosimilars and their substitution. So as I summarize, we've done a lot of work to try to enable pharmacists and physicians to work together to manage the cost of biologics and the use of limited healthcare resources without jeopardizing the effectiveness or safety of therapy. And we think this is a system that took a lot of work, and a system that's working. So with that, I will turn it back to Michael.
Thank you, Dr. Schneider. And before I begin, I just want to say that both Dr. McKibben and Dr. Schneider gave thorough presentations of the amount of work that has gone into a current system that is working well. And so Andy is going last specifically because ultimately all of this work focuses on the patient. And that's something that we can't forget. as we continue to move. Andy talks about wearing multiple hats. The different hats I've worn over the years, in addition to being the executive director of ASBM, I worked on Capitol Hill in the Energy and Commerce Committee and was fortunate there to be a lead staffer for a piece of legislation, that the Children's Health Act of 2000 that became law. Was in the administration during the creation of Part D, worked side by side with multiple secretaries and senior staff, and helped Part D become law. And so when I look at the Lee bill, which is really the focus, I would say that this slide really represents everything and the only thing that is good about the bill, and that is the name. Who isn't in favor of doing away with red tape? The problem is that the bill itself is founded on false premises. And this is a press release that was put out when the bill was announced. And based on what you just heard from Dr. McKibben and Dr. Schneider, you noticed the generic equivalent of a biologic drug is known as a biosimilar. Unlike generic drugs, many states will not allow pharmacists to substitute a biosimilar unless the FDA declares it to be an interchangeable. And since we're in the political season, fact check, the biosimilars are not generics. The FDA knows that. The entire scientific community know that. Physicians know that. It's reflected by some of the data points that Dr. McKibben pointed out, and it is a very important distinction because this bill says that they are generics. Secondly, the bill, again, from the press release that was put out when the bill was announced, after examining 15 years of data, the European Medicines Agency recently stated that switching studies are unnecessary for biosimilars to obtain interchangeable status. You heard from both Dr. McKibben and Dr. Schneider that interchangeable means something different. That is a false statement based upon a different definition in Europe, which is what both Dr. McKibben and Dr. Schneider pointed out. The term interchangeable, as it refers to in Europe, means that all biosimilars can be prescribed in place of the reference product by the physician. That is true in the United States as well. But the term interchangeable in the United States means that they were had to provide a different level of data. Again, it's been pointed out that the additional data, the switching studies, to demonstrate the effect in any given patient is at the discretion of the FDA. But it does, it is a critical component of the interchangeable biosimilar, and certainly something that was obviously critical in passing the state legislation that we passed in all 50 states. Because those of us who were involved can tell you that if it were not for interchangeable biosimilars, they would not have passed the legislation. So in reality, it's not cutting red tape. It's deeming all biosimilars interchangeable without additional data, treating them as generics, which they're not. It's restricting FDA's ability to request data for scientific determinations in interchangeable biosimilar approvals. And it's circumventing limits placed on automatic substitution by laws passed in all 50 states. So then we look at the bill. To improve the requirements for making a determination of interchangeability of a biological product and its reference product. Again, I'm looking at this from my former regulator perspective as someone who worked in the office of the secretary and oversaw the FDA. How you could argue this improves the requirements for making a determination is hard to believe. Nothing in this bill improves the requirements for making a determination of interchangeability. In fact, it does the exact opposite. Specifically, the bill establishes a presumption that an approved biosimilar is interchangeable with a reference product without the need for additional evidence from the manufacturer. We heard from Dr. McKibben why the knowledge of the approval of an interchangeable and that additional information is so important. Again, this is discretionary regulatory authority that this bill will take away. So the legislative body will interfere with the regulatory decisions of the agency. Hocus pocus, I deem you interchangeable. That's essentially what this bill does. It says that going forward, what previously would have been approved as if an application was not submitted to be an interchangeable biosimilar, all biosimilars going forward will be interchangeable. And that obviously has an impact both with regards to the confidence levels of physicians, as we have pointed out, and obviously the impact it has on state laws. So the reality of the situation is that there really are two big questions. We've talked to various legislative offices about this, and the two big questions that need to be answered are, number one, doesn't the fact that the FDA is supporting this mean it is a good idea? And why is there no opposition from physician groups? And I will address both of those as a former regulator. The first is, why is the FDA supporting legislative authority that strips its legislation that strips its discretionary authority? And in the same way that we provided, when we submitted our comments, talking about our concern for this idea through the FDA guidance, the survey that Dr. McKibben referenced, we did that because we don't want it to just be our opinion. We want to be able to show additional opinions on the topic. And so in preparation for this webinar and in thorough research for making sure that I wasn't missing something, and I've talked to two former secretaries, two former deputy secretaries, and two former FDA deputy commissioners who were colleagues of mine, and to a person, none of us can come up with any reason why our FDA or our department would ever support this. And this is not obviously a partisan issue. This is a view of why it is a bad idea for the legislation, for a legislative body to be interfering with regulatory authority. I will even point out that one of the things we've spoken about from the very beginning of the BPCIA, that is the legislation that created the pathway, was that the Congress recognized when they set it up and said that the FDA would determine how to establish the ability to approve a biosimilar as an interchangeable. So they recognize they shouldn't be. This is the exact opposite. As I said to someone recently, Congress giveth and Congress taketh away. And there shouldn't be no interference by the legislative body, which really does not have any expertise. Now, why did FDA, what's really been the premise of the FDA support of this? The first is a meta-analysis paper. And I'll just, before I go on to our response to that, just say that you could just Google criticisms and disadvantages. I've had multiple conversations with former colleagues about how the FDA generally does not look favorably upon meta-analysis. And again, look up the problems with meta-analysis and why they are controversial. And here you get some of the reasons. We, recognizing that we did not, after reading the meta-analysis paper, we thought it was incredibly flawed. So Dr. McKibben and I wrote a white paper, and there's a QR code there for that. And in that, we pointed out many of the problems and flaws with this overly conclusory study, recognizing that when it came out, it would be used for something similar to how it has been. And it is an incredibly flawed document. Highly selective and limited analysis, efficacy impacts were not evaluated, only safety, inappropriate pooling of data, extrapolates multi-switch safety from largely single-switch studies. Just a few things, you can read the white paper. But we recognize the flaws. In a recent interview, Sarah Yim talked about that the FDA was asking for Congress to eliminate the regulatory distinction between interchangeable and non-interchangeable biosimilars. And in that, in an Inside Health Policy article, that was basically the FDA officials arguing for why this legislation was needed. Even in that article, they said that accumulated scientific evidence has led the FDA to conclude that clinical studies are mostly unnecessary to determine whether a biosimilar drug should be interchangeable with its reference product, and that a switching study is not necessary in most cases. And yet, to approve 13 interchangeables that were approved, 9 of them were done without the need for a switching study, which means that it is a discretionary authority that they have. And the question is, why would they ask to have it removed? which, by the way, ties the hands for all future FDAs with regards to the ability to request this additional data. It should be noted that we're not even talking here about the original draft of the bill, which actually called for, in order for the Secretary of HHS to ask for additional data for a particular application. So that is, an application comes in, the FDA says, we think we need additional data. And the Secretary had, in the original version, had to convene a meeting with the chairman of the Help Committee and the ranking member of the Help Committee and the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee and the ranking member. Just the fact that that provision was in there, which literally had a legislative body involved in the individual applications of an approval at the department, tells you just that the overall bill has significant flaws. Also in the health policy, it says the change to eliminate additional interchangeability studies would increase patient and provider confidence in biosimilars and mean lower prices for patients. I just bring up one of the slides that Dr. McKibben did. This is our study. That's a head scratcher. 88% of respondents agree that biosimilar switching studies increase their confidence in the safety of moving their patients from an originator medicine. And in fact, and one of the things that we see from physicians in general, they understand not all biosimilars are interchangeable, but it is the data. When you looked at one of the slides Dr. McKibben presented, it is the data from the interchangeable determination that gives and has given physicians the confidence. And the second thing I would just say is, when I mentioned I've spoke with 2 former secretaries and 2 former deputy secretaries and 2 former associate commissioners from the FDA, the one thing we all know is that the FDA is not infallible. I put this slide up just as an example recently of a reversal of a decision from outside pressure, where basically the GLP-1 issue, first there was a shortage, and then the shortage was revisited because of pressure from compounders. And I just use it as an example, and I could give you 20 more of when someone from the FDA came into the secretary's office and basically brought an idea that we said, we don't think so. So I, from personal experience, just say that they do a phenomenal job. They are absolutely an outstanding gold standard organization. They are not infallible. And legislation is tying the hands of future FDA agencies as we head into a presidential election. So basically, our contention, and as I was speaking with my former colleagues, I was saying to everyone, talk me out of it, please. I'm open to what are the positives? What about this bill makes sense from an agency perspective, knowing that we have gone from simple biosimilars to monoclonal antibodies, and we're going to continue to increase on the complexity of biologics and biosimilars. And in my opinion, what I'm most concerned about, and what we collectively are most concerned about, is that this is the beginning of the erosion of the overall standard of approval for biologics beyond just biosimilars. So again, it's flawed legislations founded on the premise that all biosimilars are generics. They're not. That this policy would align us with Europe regarding automatic substitution. It does not. Supported by a weak study with flawed methodology, and that physicians, when informed, overwhelmingly oppose the bill's intent. That is the deeming. So then you say, okay, who are the primary supporters of the bills? And what jumps out at you is that the primary supporter of the bill are payers. And you have to ask yourself, why is a bill that's being supported on and sold on behalf of patients, which patients don't know about, which physicians that know about it object to it, is supported primarily by payers? And if you talk to staff about this bill, the conversation always goes right back to how the proposed savings from the program, this particular piece of legislation, S2305, can be used to pay for other programs. And as we turn it over to Andy, no one can better speak to why there should not be bartering and horse trading where patient safety is involved, and that is all this legislation is. And with that, Andy, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, well, pretty much everything that I could have said you have covered, and I won't repeat. I will just say that to dovetail off of what you said, as a patient organization representative, I don't want politicians making my personal healthcare decisions for me. I want the FDA to approve drugs when they're safe and when they're effective and when they've had the right data to approve them. And I want my physician involved in those healthcare decisions about which medicine I'm going to take. And I will tell you, you and Dr. Phil have really covered all of the work that we did to get these laws passed in every state. And for those that don't know, for 8 years, from 2013 until 2021, I, along with other patient advocates, traveled the whole United States, going state to state to ensure that these pharmacy legislation acts got passed with the patient voice representing the side that best represented patient safety. And that's what this is all really about. We know that these drugs are not generics. These are not generic drugs. And so when these new medicines started coming out and the new laws started to get formed, everyone agreed that patients had to show up and testify nationwide to get these substitution laws passed that recognized this fact that generics are different than biologics and biosimilars. And that's why we went to all these different states. And when patient organizations and patients questioned our stance on this, saying, are you sure that these things will be safe if they're substituted by a pharmacist, not by a physician, but by a pharmacist who doesn't have our medical history, who doesn't know our medical records and doesn't know our conditions well? They're just pharmacists that are dispensing medicines prescribed by the healthcare provider. And we were able to reassure them that these laws that are being passed were fair because the data that was being used for interchangeable substitution, for these interchangeables, was a high level of data, that there were switching studies, that there was a reasonable amount of data for physicians and for patients to feel comfortable being switched from an originator product to a biosimilar. And now this is a betrayal of all the work and all the promises that we made in all of these states for 8 years. Somebody's coming in with this law, not thinking it through, and they want to reverse 8 years of work. I mean, think about the work it took to get 50 state legislatures to agree. I can't even remember the last time 50 state legislatures agreed on a healthcare policy, but we got it. We got them to all agree because of the assurances that the data was going to be there for mass third-party substitution. And this bill is a betrayal of those assurances to the patients and to the physicians and to the policymakers that pass these bills, that pass these laws to protect patients. So, I'm not going to repeat everything that's been said, but the patient community feels that this law is a complete betrayal of patient rights, of patient safety, of all of the more than a decade of work and laws that were put together to protect patients for these really new classes of medicines. And this law would reverse all of that and betray all of the stakeholders that bought into 50 states passing legislation. So I'm not going to, again, repeat everything that's been said already, but suffice it to say that the patient community thinks that this is a ridiculous law that would require a congressional committee's approval for data to be used for an FDA scientific determination. It's never happened. It shouldn't happen. And we want politicians really to stay out of our healthcare decision making. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Michael, and take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Andy. So I just want to kind of reinforce, before we get into the panel discussion, I just want to reinforce what Andy is the point that he's making. And it's one that I think we've talked about, but it can get lost in the overall conversation as we walk through the bill. The net effect of this bill, the deeming of interchange of all biosimilars to be, literally magic wand deeming of all biosimilars to be interchangeable. The net effect of that is, because of the work Andy talked about and Dr. Schneider talked about, that we would have automatic substitution in all 50 states, because essentially the legislation that's been passed in all 50 states says only interchangeable biosimilars can be automatically substituted. Now, why that's important is that, Andy's in a way being kind, saying maybe folks don't know about the effect of this legislation, but the reality is the payer knows what the effect of this legislation is. And at the end of the day, back to the two elephants in the room, the bigger one really in some respects is physicians. I was asked, why aren't physicians? One of the reasons we did the survey, I said, why aren't physicians? No one's speaking up. Why aren't physicians speaking up? They're not speaking up because they don't know about it. And Dr. McKibben, I see your hand up. Go ahead. No better than you to talk about that.
I want to just make an additional point. Andy was talking about needing data. And I just want to talk about, because we looked at the meta-analysis and we talk about the quality of data. And I go back to what I said, quality is a process, not a thing. We get higher and higher levels of understanding with time, and we want real data. So what do I mean by that? Well, we know that when we do clinical guidelines, you say the American College of Gastroenterology or whatever, if you look at old guidelines, they told you what to do. The new ones go over the strength and quality of data that support the decision in every recommendation. So what does that mean? It means that there are different levels of quality in the data and different levels of strength. And we recognize that not all studies are equivalent, and we sometimes need to synthesize this data. So if you want to know about it, that's an example. Go look at a clinical guideline. They explain the methodology. The second thing is that, like a meta-analysis, and one of the critiques on Michael's slide is it tends to lump all people together. If you look at clinical studies that have evolved over the years into blinded studies and double-blinded studies, et cetera, we are in the diversity and equity and inclusion stage of clinical studies. One study done on a small group in Norway is not necessarily going to extrapolate to Mexico or Africa or places like that. So we have to be able to look at subgroups, et cetera, and by automatically lumping all patients together as little Lego pieces that are interchangeable is not right. That is not happening in the real world. We're going the other direction, and this bill, in my opinion, as a physician, does that, and it violates the doctor-patient relationship. So I'll leave it at that.
Agreed. Dr. Schneider, you want to add into that?
Well, one of the things that's really important is establishing trust within the clinical community, which includes first and foremost the physician, but also the pharmacist that has responsibility for talking to patients about their medicines and helping them make the best use of them. And so what bothers me is that the ability of physicians first and pharmacists also to make decisions based on the needs of patients for whom they have accountability and responsibility is being usurped by fiat through the legislative process and politicians, which have political issues, and they're accountable for politicians to larger groups of patients to get votes, as opposed to individual patients for whom we care. And so that's what bothers me about that. The other is we rely on the FDA with all the limits, a few limits that you mentioned, Michael, to provide, require evidence-based studies to determine what are used in these patients. And so when that becomes a political issue, I don't think that is in the best interest of patient care, and it certainly ties the hands of healthcare professionals.
Yeah, I want to say too, again, I think that we all, this group, I was saying earlier in the week to my colleagues here, I felt like on this topic, one day I thought we're the Beatles. We've been working on this issue like a quartet for a long time. We all bring different perspectives. We all basically, Andy and I worked side by side on one element of it, representing, Andy talking on the patient side. He and I have, as he mentioned, we've traveled all over Europe together and Australia and other places, kind of gathering information about this topic. The U.S. on the interchangeable biosimilar, we have argued, is an advantage over the rest of the world, because the interchangeable has been a difference maker, and it's always bothered the Europeans, and it's always bothered even in Canada to a certain extent. When we would meet with Health Canada, they would say, oh, well, all biosimilars are interchangeable. And you're having a conversation like who's on first, because you're saying, yes, they are, as you understand that. But as we understand it, there's a difference. And in reality, we've even met with regulators who recognize that difference, like the TGA, that said when they were having problems with uptake, saying, tell us more about the interchangeable biosimilar, because I told them you could approve an FDA approved interchangeable biosimilar as interchangeable yourself, and you could benefit from the system. So this is a case of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And basically this will really upend the system, and it will happen quickly. And I would just point to the Oregon law, where they're basically working on, we object, by the way, to the Oregon law, but at the end of the day, Oregon could make that determination. If they say we want to make all biosimilars substitutable automatically, including non-interchangeable, that's their prerogative. Any state could do that. But the net effect of the Lee bill is to basically just come in through the back door and change state legislation. That was the most recent bill was passed in Oklahoma in 2021. That's 3 years ago. So we finished that process in 2021. And Andy knows well that the first 5 years was getting about 3 states on board, because it took a long time to work out those differences. And then finally everybody got on. So it hasn't been that long since all of this was passed. And, again, I go back to the payers who are driving it. I think that's, to me, the most frustrating piece of this is that it's obvious who's benefiting from it and who's driving it. And at the end of the day, in a way, this happened in Canada. We watched it happen, and we argued strongly against it, which is where, there the government took away the opportunity to make switching determinations province by province. And we certainly want to protect that right here. The FDA's authority is discretionary. It's something they can use if they want to. If they say, we think that we have enough from you without switching studies to approve you as an interchangeable biosimilar, they can do that right now. There's nothing this bill does that they can't do. Instead, this is the opposite, where they're saying, oh, we think we're there already, and so, please take away our ability to seek switching studies. It doesn't make sense. And just one final thing for me is, I actually, and I mentioned I spoke with, 2 former secretaries, whatever. One of my former colleagues, who is a former FDA commissioner, was on this call. I asked him to listen in on this call, and I appreciate the fact that he did, because I'm open to, anybody convincing me that this bill is a good idea. It's flawed, founded on faulty premises, and is very unfortunate if it ends up passing, because of the impact it will have on patients and physicians. I'll just turn it over to you guys. Andy?
Well, one of the things that I look at, and I think healthcare professionals look at when drug treatment decisions are made, are, is it effective? We're prescribing it because we're treating something that needs to be treated. Secondly, is it safe? We're not going to cause unnecessary harm to patients. And the third thing is the responsible use of limited resources, in other words, the cost. And with biologics being so expensive, that's sort of taken precedence over safety and effectiveness considerations when it comes to the political arena. But I think it's important to remember that when treatment decisions are made, the effectiveness and safety are more important than the cost. And so the FDA is who we look to for safety first and effectiveness. And so I think that dial is important to them. They have no responsibility for looking at cost issues. What Congress is looking at right now is only the cost dial, without accounting for the fact that this has an impact on effectiveness and safety of therapy. So that's why I'm bothered by this.
Well, and I'm going to add one more thing that I don't think we've mentioned really, is that with regards to the interchangeable designation, the benefit of the additional data, physicians understand that data is sometimes provided and sometimes not. They understand, 9 of 13 that, those that required switching studies, those that didn't. But ultimately, there's another issue of why this is a little bit of bait and switch with regards to the piece of legislation we've been talking about, which is that interchangeable biosimilars in general are perceived as something that is a positive. And so, for example, if you look at the state level, the way that non-interchangeable biosimilars, we are not saying that non-interchangeable biosimilars are inferior in quality, and physicians understand that. It's simply that there is an additional level of data that is provided, or in the alternative, in other words, it doesn't have to be a switching study, but it is essentially viewed, because in the slide that Dr. McKibben put up in the very beginning, where he talked about physicians' confidence in biosimilars, in interchangeables, the key word was data. It was because of the data. And that is something that, as we go around and talk to physicians, and Dr. McKibben can certainly talk about this, there is a big difference between the absence of data and the presence of data. So the idea that, there has been no data that has demonstrated that there's a need to get more additional data is essentially what the meta-analysis paper said, which, is a ridiculous idea.
I want to field a question here, Michael, from Tiffany. In your opinion, what's the best way to explain to patients how to navigate interchangeability when they're already fearful of biosimilars? The way to look at this, in my opinion, C. Everett Koop, past Surgeon General, he's the guy with the Amish beard, great guy, but he said the best medicines don't work if patients don't take them. So I wrote a white paper for the Digestive Disease National Coalition a few years ago about non-medical switching. Profound clinical impact. People are fearful, or they get switched, or it doesn't work, or they have side effects, or the cost differences, and it's a real thing. You can't just switch it and not have it. So as a physician, I can't just say whatever I want. Don't worry, honey, everything will be okay. I have to give you true statements. And what I would say is that biosimilars, with the data that we have, are just as efficacious. If you start on one, we try to limit it. I think, look at the bell curve of patients. Most people are in the middle. People at the upper end with 8 or 10 comorbid conditions, you may not want to switch it. And that's the doctor-patient discussion. I build confidence in the treatment decision with you. I mean, I don't think that just picking online and ordering like in Amazon is how you get your medicines. You have to get informed consent on expensive medication with profound impact, and you're probably going to be on it for many, many years. So what you need is a good provider relationship and a discussion. But interchangeability is a higher level of confidence, and we've shown that in our data. And I think that we can say that. I mean, maybe that's an op-ed that should be out there. Patients should have confidence in interchangeables or something, where Andy, a stakeholder group, could get together and talk about that. But that is my way of looking at it. You have to have confidence in the medicine, not just as a provider, but as a patient. So I know we're out of time, so I'll leave it at that.
Just a final thing, there's some QR codes up there for folks with additional resources about interchangeable biosimilars. I just want to thank everybody who took the time today, and certainly if there are any questions that come in, we will make sure that they get answered. So thank you, especially to the panelists. Appreciate it, all the hard work that you all put in, and thanks, and see you all soon.
Bye, Andy, everyone.